All right, it is 2 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get going. I want to thank everybody for joining our webinar on the role of generative AI in drafting and publishing in academic writing. Many of you may recognize both me and Dr. Kirkpatrick from the panel that we did with a few other panelists this spring when we talked about AI and generative AI in publication. So this is going to be a bit of a continuation of that. Not that you need that background, but a little bit more in the more detail about how it works, how we use it, how we can use it for publication, some of the potential problems, and some of the benefits. So with that very brief introduction, I also want to say that if you have any questions or comments, anything that you would like for us to discuss or answer, or anything you'd like to bring up, go ahead and put it into the Q&A panel and we will get around to it when we get the chance. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Kirkpatrick.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, so next slide, please. So I have no relevant financial interests, arrangements, or affiliations to disclose. I should put this out here that I'm not an AI expert. I just probably utilize it more than my colleagues in my division and some other people in my department. And so I just wanted you to know that I started off not knowing a lot too. And so getting a good foundation will be important moving forward. Okay, so I feel like AI is really permeating every aspect of our lives at this point in time. Next slide. And so some ways that you might see AI in your everyday life are things like your smartwatch, like the Apple Watch or the Samsung watches that are out there, your Alexa, your smart TVs, but also it's starting to really permeate our cell phones as well. And so I use Gemini Assistant for many things. And it really comes down with the ability to understand and respond in natural language, which AI is starting to do quite well. And these assistants really help users manage their schedules, they can set reminders, send messages, and even control smart home devices. And so I think overall, its integration across devices ensures that users have seamless experiences. But then again, it takes away from our own experience and our own ability to do these things. So next slide, please. And so some other ways that we're starting to see it in the academic setting are productivity enhancers. Our institution has started utilizing Microsoft 365 Copilot, which is an end-user AI assistance interface, which combines the AI foundational models directly with user data. And can interface with Excel, Microsoft Graph, Word, and other Microsoft 365 applications. And really what Copilot does, it aims to streamline virtually all types of work and increase productivity. On top of this, there's numerous apps out there that can help with productivity as well. One such example is Use Motion AI, which is an AI scheduling assistant and can map out the most efficient schedule for you. Next slide. Email assistants are something that I use pretty frequently. Grammarly is one that a lot of people tend to move towards just to help with grammar and format and spelling. There is quite a few widgets available for Outlook, Ghostwriter being one of them. And these apps can essentially help you write emails quickly. And what is interesting about some of these assistants is how you can modify the tone and the style. And so you can see here, for this particular email, I made the style convincing and the tone confident. And from a creativity standpoint, I use the default ChatGPT 0.7 version. And I also was able to define my role as college professor. And so that helped also refine the response to the audience. Next slide. And then social media. I mean, I think this is a double-edged sword. TikTok especially has gotten really good at this. TikTok has found a way to keep its users on its app for hours at a time, 80 minutes on average. which is really an impressive feat considering the ever shorter attention spans that people have. And so it's achieved this by serving an infinite pool of bite-sized content that it knows will hook you through its unique algorithms, and then refining those algorithms as your tastes change or as it gathers more data. And so it's constantly learning off you, and then it's also using demographic data from users like you to craft your algorithm as well. Next slide. And then we're also seeing this on the road. Smart cars have started to come through into the market. Tesla being one of them. The Mercedes-Benz also is piloting a drive pilot system, and all of these are level 3 autonomous driving systems, meaning they can self-drive. A lot of these systems are developed through synthetic data, and they can be hands-off. But as you know, there's articles every day that show that these things aren't perfect, and there are accidents and glitches that do happen. Next slide. And so I think it's important to really get just a basic understanding of generative AI. I don't think a lot of people use it because they don't know what it is. Like artificial intelligence is just not one technology. It's rather a collection of them. And so what really makes a good generative AI program or application, you need 3 key elements, and that's quality, speed, and diversity. And so quality is especially important for applications because you need to use good quality data. For example, in speech generation, if you use poor speech quality, it'll be difficult to understand. And in image generation, the desired output should be visually indistinguishable from natural images, which we're getting there. Diversity is also important. A good generative model captures the minority modes in its data distribution, and this helps reduce undesired biases in the learned models. And then speed is also a factor here. We want the information and we want it fast. So many interactive applications require fast generation, and things like real-time image editing can allow us to use or can allow use in content creation workflows. Next slide. So some of the more popular generative AI applications are these, really fall under these 4 domains: language, audio, visual, and synthetic data. Language is the most advanced domain at this point in time. One of the most popular examples are the large language-based generative models, or LLMs as they're called. And these are these leverage a wide variety of tasks, including text generation, code development, translation, and can even understand genetic sequencing. And so the programs like ChatGPT are large language models that we're seeing used in everyday life. Audio, this is really an emerging field. Examples include models being able to develop songs or snippets of audio clips with text inputs, recognize objects and videos, and create accompanying noise for different video footage. And these have become really advanced, and now there's thousands of apps available for people to use. Another is visual. And so this really encompasses the creation of 3D images, avatars, videos, graphs, and other illustrations. From an academic standpoint, these applications can help create scientific images and also figures and tables. And then synthetic data. Synthetic data is extremely useful to train AI models when data doesn't exist or is restricted or is simply unable to address corner cases with the highest accuracy. And so the development of synthetic data through these models is perhaps one of the most impactful solutions for overcoming data challenges, including in academia. And so these autonomous driving systems are largely based off synthetic data or simulated data. Next slide. So these are some of the most common models that you'll see as you start reading about it. If you're curious about AI or utilizing it in your research, generative adversarial networks, transformers, and recurrent neural networks are the ones that I see probably the most. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, just in terms of how they're set up. I think we want to get to the examples that we created. So This will be available as a PDF after the presentation, and so this will be available to look at a little further. Next slide. And so when I talk about neural networks, and when you talk about a lot of these models, neural networks pops up. I feel like it's important to understand what a neural network is. And so a neural network is really set up human brain. And so you have neurons or nodes that transmit information. And these neurons receive input data, process it, and then pass it on to the next layer of neurons. And these hidden layers can be really vast. And so there's usually, like when the data enters one or more of the hidden layers where the processing happens, a lot of weights and biases can exist within these layers. And so eventually what will happen is as it goes through these hidden layers and it's processed, and as the model learns and changes the weights and biases of the different nodes, you'll get an output, and this output will change over time as you train the model with better data. Next slide. And so there's a lot of benefits here. I mean, I think the strengths of generative AI are scalability, cost savings, content generation, of course, can help with automation and efficiency, data analysis and personalization, but there's a lot of challenges of generative AI. And so I'm going to pass it to Emily here to go over those and her slides.
Thanks. So one of the things that I really want to talk about that comes up a lot with when we're discussing generative AI is the idea of theft of intellectual property or plagiarism. And at the risk of oversimplifying to the point of it just being incorrect, most AI models, they're not taking inspiration from their training data, they're taking samples. So rather, you can see the way that this works most clearly in images, because you can really kind of get a sense of how, to some extent, there's a little bit of a copy-paste element going on. So for example, I asked ChatGPT to make me a picture of a person inspired by Van Gogh. So what actually happened here is that it took samples of the textures, the colors, the patterns of Starry Night, and it just applied it to a picture of a person, like all the way down to the extent that I didn't ask it to put in like these little town and villages down here, but that's what's in Starry Night. It was just sampling it. It isn't taking inspiration from it the way that a person is. And while we can really clearly see this in images a lot of times, it does happen in words as well. So for example, I asked it to write me an introduction to a story in the style of Jane Austen. And it pretty much copied word for word one of the most famous opening lines in British literature. So you can see the version here that ChatGPT wrote. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single woman in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a husband. And here's the original from Jane Austen. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So it's not taking inspiration here the way that I kind of asked it to do it in this style. This is just sampling. And then when I asked it to generate a picture of an image of Jane Austen, this is pretty much the only image that we have that was done of Jane Austen in her lifetime. And I don't know what this is, but it is some uncanny valley image of Jane Austen. And one of the other problems that we have with this is that when it's doing this sample, it's often not able to tell you where it's getting these ideas from, where these textures, these pictures, these phrases. So while I can tell you, I pulled this from this website, I got it from this author, this is who originally did this research. When researchers ask ChatGPT to come up with similar citations, it struggles. So for example, in this one case, they found that when trying to generate medical content, 47% of the citations were entirely fabricated. 46% of them were, clearly gesturing towards something, but were cited inaccurately. And only 7% of them were both accurate and actually real. And it's not just citations that it has a problem with. Also, it can provide just factually wrong things. So for example, Elsevier, the academic publication company, created a reviewer assistant. And the idea is that reviewers could talk to the AI and ask questions about factual information in the article that they're reviewing, or ask what it thinks of the grammar, the spelling, that kind of thing. It's just supposed to be helping them understand both the content and the writing of what they're reviewing. This right here is from an article or from a letter to the editor where one of the reviewers asked about bond energies in an oral tumor. And it was so wrong that they said, this result is considered shocking and serious mistake by artificial intelligence. It can be expressed more seriously as a fatal error. Elsevier itself said that the tool has a lot of benefits, especially in linguistic and typographical errors, but they did say that the use of AI for scientific research evaluation can be a double-edged sword. So while this clearly has a lot of problems, there's elements of theft, there's elements of it just being wildly inaccurate. That can kind of lead us with the question of, why are we here? Why are we here learning how to use AI that is going to steal stuff and lie to me? And I think that part of what we need to discuss is that, first of all, while there is definitely some artistry to good academic writing, good scientific writing, it's a lot more formulaic than art. So in some cases, I know that people have commented to me that their field tends to be so formulaic that they struggle not to plagiarize. And I also think that if there's any field that is appropriate for using and training AI, it is academic writing. It's not something that we do for the artistry. It's something that we do to convey the research. It is the research outcomes that matter, and writing is just the vehicle. So if we think of AI as a tool that we can use to improve the way that we communicate those research outcomes, I think it can be a really positive thing. And I also think that it's worth discussing that, like any tool, it can have its risks. And if used in certain ways, there are still a lot of benefits to it. So with that in mind, this lab that they divided up their trainees and their junior faculty and had them write review articles. They used AI for some of them and not for others. They measured outcomes that included things like total time spent on the manuscript, time spent fact-checking or finding references, and time spent revising based on reviewer feedback, as well as a more qualitative assessment from reviewers, both internal reviewers and from the journal. To me, one of the most significant takeaways was that the users who found AI to be most significantly useful were those who had experience both in their field and in using AI. So in this case, their research professor had worked with AI before, was obviously quite experienced in writing articles for the field, and could put those sets of knowledge together and saw the most significant improvement in how much time it took them to get a manuscript ready for publication. And so some of the other things that they talk about is how, while overall, yes, it did reduce the time to a finished manuscript, it also improved the structure. Qualitatively, reviewers found the structure when AI generated an outline for them to be much easier to follow, a lot easier to read. And just in general, the papers tended to be easier to understand because AI often uses a little bit more simple language than scientists tend to. You know, they tend to use a lot of the jargon of their field, where AI is often trained to simplify things, which even when you're writing for a technical audience can make it easier to understand. And the same thing is actually true. A lot of times we tend to not like repetition when we're reading things, but when it comes to that really technical writing, having that context of, this is what I'm going to tell you, this is the information, this is what I said, actually makes scientific writing a lot easier to understand. So people tended to much prefer, even just on a subjective qualitative level, the articles that were written with AI input. However, of course, there are some potential problems. One is that, like I mentioned, it does require a skill set to use it effectively. It did increase time spent fact checking. You have to go kind of step by step through every single thing that AI generates for you to make sure that it is something that you feel comfortable putting in your paper, because it can actually lead to inaccuracies and plagiarism if not used carefully. Another thing worth kind of considering with this is also that different organizations have different AI policies. So for example, the NIH, they have warned that their policies are continuously evolving, especially as AI capabilities evolve, but just in general, they do not think it's appropriate to be used for grant review. That's primarily because I think Dr. Kirkpatrick mentioned some of this at the beginning, that anything that you put into AI can be used to train the model. There are some versions that are considered like safe for internal information. For example, like IU uses a version of Copilot that can use internal university data. But just in general, the NIH strongly discourages using AI for review. And they also make it very clear that users are responsible for any misconduct committed by the AI models. So if your AI generates something that is stolen, that is just Starry Night laid on top of a person, then that is intellectual property theft, and you are responsible for that, even if the AI did it. Different journals have different policies. So in this case, the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology is kind of on the same wavelength here, that anything that AI generates for you, you are responsible for it. And if that means that it is inaccurate, or if it is stolen language, then that falls back on you, and saying, well, the AI did it is not an acceptable excuse. So with that kind of context, I'm going to throw it back to Lindsey, and she'll take it from here.
Thanks, Emily. Can you please advance to the next slide? So in terms of opportunities for use in academic writing, there are really 6 domains where there are numerous applications and programs available for all of these different domains, including idea development and research design, content development and structuring, and literature review and synthesis. Content development and structuring is where you'll find the writing assistants and the visual components of these. But there's a lot of different ways that you can use it, as you can see here, even going as far as hypothesis generation and brainstorming. And the models are getting better at this. Again, they can't really reason. As Emily said, these models, especially the large language-based models, are trained utilizing existing content and data. And so you really want to be careful about putting your own data or unpublished data into these applications, because you don't know how it's going to be used. Is it going to be used to train the model? Can someone else pull it over time? And so I think these are all considerations that have to be made as you think about how you may utilize AI in your own academic writing. Next slide. And so these are the other 3 domains. So data management and analysis. There are a lot of applications available for this. I utilize ChatGPT for some stats, but I don't utilize a lot of other applications for that. I use my own biostatistician. But for people that don't have those resources, it can be very helpful. I think data visualization is something that I struggle with the most. And so some of these applications and programs can help build figures and models and different ways of looking at the data, which maybe I wouldn't have thought about on my own. Editing and review is probably where I use it the most. I use ChatGPT and some of the large language-based models like Jasper for writing refinement and formatting. I use it as an assistant for that. So for proofreading, especially for editing. If I need to trim down something and make it more concise, I'll utilize it for that. Sometimes I just stare at a sentence and I don't like the way that it's written. And so I might use it to refine that sentence or change that sentence. Another interesting way to use it is in terms of like publishing assistance is helping with citations. I know Emily said, citations can be wrong, the ones that they pull for you, but if you're like me and hate EndNote, sometimes the way that it's written is not correct, or the way it kind of pops out of EndNote is not correct. So I'll throw it into ChatGPT and say, hey, can you format this in MLA style? And it'll do that for me. Next slide. And so, as we said before, there's numerous applications and programs. I think ChatGPT is the one that people have heard of the most. And so we're going to utilize this for our examples today. Again, this is a large language model that utilizes existing content and data to train its models. And so you're only as strong as the data that's being used. And so again, there's obviously some issues with this, but it can be very helpful. Next slide. And so I think it's important to think about your prompt whenever you're using these large language-based model programs like ChatGPT. You're only as strong as your prompt, unfortunately. And how I build my prompts, I like to be specific in my format. So try to give an idea of what the output should look like. Is it going to be a list? Is it going to be a code block? Is it going to be a table? Is it going to be a paragraph? Is it 250 words? Is it 500 words? The target audience is important. So I would certainly write something if I'm writing for a journal, I'm going to write it much differently than I would write for maybe an undergrad student that I'm trying to teach about the subject or a presentation. Same with examples. But by providing examples of what you do and don't like in your prompt, you can get closer to the desired output, and you can just refine and regenerate and iterate these several rounds until you get the output that you desire. Role playing is important, and I'll kind of go into this as I go into one of my examples, but by putting who you're writing to, but also defining your own role, it certainly changes the output. And then references and resources. There's a lot of different models where you can, or different programs where you can copy a citation, put it in there and summarize that particular reference. And then you can also refer to earlier responses and conversations to help refine output. And so kind of parsing them into different conversations can be helpful if you're trying to get certain outputs. Next slide. And so the first example that I want to go over is text generation. I'm using an example here of something that I had to do quite often, which is writing a letter of recommendation for a medical student. And again, it's only as strong as your prompt. I made a 250-word template for a letter of recommendation for a medical student interested in pediatric medicine. And when you look at really the meat of the letter, what I'm saying here is really generic. If I'm writing a letter of recommendation for a student, it's usually a good one. I will tell a student if I don't feel like I can give them a honest or a heartfelt letter of recommendation before I agree to it. And so when I'm writing these letters of recommendation, I feel like I could say all of these things about most of the students that I've seen or worked with on service or when I'm on clinical rotations. And so again, it doesn't really give you a lot of personalization. And so you can refine your prompt. And so can you go to the next slide, Emily? To be a little bit more specific. And so I used a 250-word template here, and I wanted an enthusiastic letter of recommendation for a medical student interested in pediatric medicine written with specific clinical examples. So I picked congenital heart disease and asthma just because it was what came to my head immediately. And I put it in the voice of an assistant professor of pediatric medicine at a large teaching hospital. Can you click forward? And so if you look at the meat of the template now, you can see that things are getting a little bit more specific. I'm telling them when I saw them and what role they played in certain cases that we saw together. And so it really adds a level of personalization to the letter that a lot of admissions committees are going to be looking for. Do you actually know this student, and how do you know them? And so you can refine this a little bit more if you want to move to the next slide, by even providing what you want to emphasize. And so I created a template, again, another enthusiastic letter of recommendation for a medical student interested in pediatric medicine, with emphasizing really 3 things that we find important in terms of our resident selection committee, and that's clinical acumen, leadership, and volunteerism or humanism, or altruism. And so if you look at the meat of the letter, you can see here it gets even more personalized, and it shows that I know this student very well compared to maybe some other letters of recommendation that they're receiving from other students. And again, I utilize all this text generation really as a first draft. I don't just copy and paste this into the letter and, send it to the selection committees for these residents. I go through, I make sure the information's accurate. I take out what I don't need. I put in stuff that I think is important, and make sure that it's completely accurate and true based on their skill set and their experiences. Can you please move forward with the next slide? Another way that I utilize it a lot, as I said before, is revision and editing. Every journal has different formatting. Some abstracts need to be 250 words, some need to be 300 or 100. So it can be a little difficult to format these and quickly. And so I just took an abstract for one of my papers, and I asked the large language model to cut the abstract down to 150 words. And the abstract here is 250 words, like the original abstract. And so this is what it popped out for the 150 word abstract. And I felt it, seemed pretty consistent with what I had written in the 250 word abstract. Again, you have to go through, you have to confirm accuracy, make sure that your voice is not lost in this. And I end up usually changing many of the sentences to reflect my own voice and what I find important in terms of information. The next example is something else that I mentioned. Sometimes I just stare at a sentence and I hate the way it's written. And so I'll ask the language model to give me 3 different ways of writing it. And I will look at all the versions. I'll make sure they're accurate. And then I might pick a sentence from the version, and then I end up usually changing it anyway, but it gets me started. It gets the juices flowing. I sometimes feel like that's half the battle, is just getting the juices flowing so you can actually move forward with writing. Next slide. And then I use it a lot for formatting citations as well. Every journal is different in what style they like. Oftentimes what pops out in EndNote is not correct, as I said before. And so I'll ask it to change the references to a certain style. And you can see that here. I changed it from, I think it's the ACS style to MLA style. And it was accurate when I went through and checked them. And again, you have to check these too, because sometimes ChatGPT likes to make up things. Next step.
Okay, so a couple more use cases. One of them is that Lindsey and I did work with ChatGPT when we were initially planning this webinar. So there are a couple things that we both really like using AI for, and one is generating a talk title ideas. I think that this is great for posters, for talks, for papers. It can give you sometimes unexpectedly creative ideas that you really like. And sometimes you can just grab something that you wouldn't have considered before and start workshopping and moving forward from there. So that was what we began with, by saying like, hey, we're giving a talk, give us a title. And of course, you can always give it more or less information as you see fit. But we liked number 2, so we went with that. And I said, okay, so will you give me a 4-sentence summary of this talk? So it gave us 4 sentences. And then what we did, we didn't just copy and paste this. We went through the whole thing, step by step, sentence by sentence, decided what we did and didn't like, made edits, made revisions, kind of like Lindsey was saying, that sometimes you just feel like you want something to be a little bit different. So we gave it a sentence that it had given us and said, can you try rewriting this in a few different ways? It gave us a few different suggestions, a few different recommendations, and we did a lot of our own rewording. So ultimately, after kind of some back and forth, we started with what it initially gave us and our own version of it. So while there's definitely a lot of similarities, we've put it in our own voice to some extent. We've made sure that it reflects what we want it to say. And at no point did we just copy and paste what it said and be like, yep, and that is good enough, and I'm not going to read it. And I do want to make sure that everybody understands how important that is, because there are absolutely examples of publications, published papers that include phrases where the AI said something like, certainly, here are 3 examples of how that is true, and included that part of the AI output in their papers, which mortifying, absolutely mortifying. So do not just accept anything that it's given you for all of those reasons that we have discussed, in addition to the fact that it just can make you look really bad. And then finally, while Lindsey and I stopped kind of here because we both had a pretty good idea of what we wanted to include in the webinar, you can still kind of carry on and say, will you create an outline for the talk? And it will give you an outline. You can say, I like this part. Will you add this? Will you remove this? Kind of like Lindsey was saying, like, this is a bit of a give and take. This is a conversation between you and the language model. And then because most of these tools, including ChatGPT, have a limit to how much information you can give it and it will give you in return at any one time, the best way to do it is to have it make an outline for you. And then you say, okay, will you generate content for section 1, section 2, section 3? And give it a word limit of what kind of size you're going for. You can also ask it to make it sound more technical, more simple, more formal, more casual, whatever kind of vibe you're going for. You can even give it, I want it to be published in this journal. Will you write it in a tone appropriate for that journal? And it will do its best to work within that limit. So another example is that you can get it to explain things to you in a way that is suited exactly for what you need. So for example, I am the science writer here. My background, my PhD is in history. So a lot of times people start talking about things and I'm not exactly following. So I have customized my ChatGPT so that it understands that I'm a science writer. I don't have a scientific background. I work in maternal pediatric therapeutics. We have NICHD funding. I'll need help taking complicated scientific concepts and making them easier to understand. And then I also say that when I ask it to summarize a research paper, there are very specific things that I'm going to be looking for. So these 2 questions are ways that you can just generally customize ChatGPT to how it gives you information. So as an example, the other day, Sarah sent me a request for creating a visualization that included some Bayesian forecasting. So I said, what is Bayesian statistics? And it gave me a lot of background information. And then it also gave me this example. Oops. And what's important to note about this example is that it is specific to pharmacology, because it knows that that's the field that I work in, and that it knows that that's going to help me understand how this is relevant to my field. So that is something that's really helpful if you kind of set it up to understand what position you're coming from. You can do this on a case-by-case basis as well, kind of like Lindsey was saying, like, you know, I'm a pediatric researcher or a professor of pediatrics. I'm writing this kind of letter this is the tone I want to go to. But in this case, you can also have it customized for all of your chats with it. And this is going to be a really helpful way of not only having things explained to you, but also sometimes when you are so deep in a field, you forget how to explain things to other people who are not deep in the field. So it can also be really useful for that. Like explain Bayesian statistics to a 16-year-old, for example, and it will give you a much more simplified version of that type of statistics. So I think, Lindsey, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So just to point out, there are a lot of customizations that have been made to ChatGPT and a lot of applications that have come out of that. And so if you pull up ChatGPT, there's a section where you can go to specific custom bots in order to generate the outcome that you want. And so I thought I just would put some of the ones that I've looked at before and that a lot of people utilize at baseline. And so there's applications for everything. For writing, you can even humanize your writing. So if you generate it via AI and you think it sounds too robotic, you can actually humanize it if you want. Productivity, again, these all exist. There are applications that can help with diagrams and help create slides for your PowerPoints. And then research and analysis, there are several that are available for that, including for Excel. Microsoft 365 Copilot is also starting to kind of integrate into Excel and do something very similar. Next slide. And so these are just some examples of the writing assistants available. Some are very more geared just towards the writing component like PaperPal. You can paraphrase, trim, make academic. It can write for you. It can research and cite for you, but it seems to be more geared towards the actual academic writing process. And then there's ones that look like ChatGPT and are very similar. And these are Copy AI is one of the chats available, but you'll see that they look very similar and produce, similar output. The next slide. I thought I would point out some of the things available for charts and diagrams, as well as figure help. Diagramming AI is one of them. Chart AI is another. I use Whimsical. I just like the manual component of it a little bit more. But there, again, are thousands of applications out there, programs out there that you can look at and find the one that works best for you. Next slide. And then paper summarizers, I think, are an interesting kind of facet of these programs that have come out. There are a number out there. Scholarsy is the one that I've heard of the most, but Inago and Resumer are also ones that seem to be utilized pretty frequently. And these can summarize the paper into whatever kind of output that you want, whether it be a flashcard, just like a page overview of the paper. This can be really helpful, I think, if you're doing reviews or writing a review to help you summarize. But again, any data that, or any writing or data that you pull from these papers, you definitely want to confirm that it's correct from the paper itself. Next slide. And so I think overall, we just wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. If there is something in particular in terms of ChatGPT that you want to see, we might be able to pull up the app and actually do it in real time, but we thought we would just leave this open for questions for now. I don't see any hands up or questions. And so if people don't have questions, we can give you some of your time back. Emily and I discussed putting this as a PDF and sending it out. So you have some of the examples on how to write a prompt, some of the models available, but also some of the programs that are being utilized for different aspects of the academic writing process. And so we can send these out to the participants, and then you can have it on hand to refer back to. Is it Taina Moore? Is that correct?
It's Taina.
Taina. Sorry, I mispronounced your name. What's your question?
It's okay. One, I would like to say that I think the chat is disabled for attendees. So I was gonna originally type my question, but it wouldn't let me.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. But my question was going to be, so like I know one of the big things that you kind of had mentioned in the beginning was just making sure that what like the large language model does like spit back out for you is like correct and not plagiarized. How would you, I guess, go about making sure like once it does give you something back that it's not something like word for word written by somebody else?
Right. I mean, I think in general, I use everything as that comes out of ChatGPT and some of these large language-based model programs as a first draft. It's never the final draft. It's oftentimes just for me to get the juices flowing. Other people might use it a different way, but I also am concerned about that. I certainly don't want to plagiarize anything unintentionally or unknowingly. And so by the time the paragraph or the sentence that I'm pulling from ChatGPT that I'm using in my paper, by the time I get done with it, it oftentimes looks nothing like the original sentence. And so that's how I avoid it, because I agree. I think we have to be very careful in that regard.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
I agree. I would definitely second that, that generally speaking, if you do think like, oh, I love this sentence, but I want to make sure it's not coming directly from another paper, you just throw it into Google. Especially if you're kind of going for a more scholarly tone, you can put it in into Google Scholar and see if anything comes up. But like Lindsey said, generally speaking, I try to consider it a first draft.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So it looks like chat is now available. So if there's anybody else who wanted to throw something in the chat, it should be available now. Or like Taina did, you can just raise your hand and you'll be promoted to be able to speak. Well, I think if that is all, I want to thank everybody so much for joining us today. I hope this was helpful. You can always reach out to me and Lindsey if you've got any questions about anything that we've discussed today. If you don't have our contact information, you can always email info@mprint.org and somebody will be sure to get back to you. So I just really want to thank everybody for joining us and I hope that you all have a great day.